Because of religion, more human beings have been murdered, tortured, maimed, denigrated, discriminated against, humiliated, hated, and scorned than for any other reason in the totality of the history of man. There appears to exist some sort of mass delusional belief that there was a crucifixion and subsequent resurrection in which a man named Jesus rose from the grave after 3 days, and then suddenly the word spread rapidly throughout the world and people just promptly embraced the new religion. But nothing could be further from the truth. It took centuries for the church to become established, and this was done not through peaceful propagation of the teachings of Christ, but by violent, bloody, and horrific torture, conquest, and warfare. In fact, the Catholic Church invented and or adopted the most sickening torture devices and methods ever conceived. People were converted to the new faith by the most inhumane means imaginable. Now, this information concerning the Roman Catholic Church's conversion methods is truly disturbing and is enough to turn the stomach. The criminal activities of the Catholic Church continue to the present day, as with the widespread abuse of children and also financial crimes, among others. You might want to grab yourself a sick bag for this segment. Now, I was raised and indoctrinated within the Catholic tradition. Thankfully, my parents weren't all that strict with it, but my brothers and I were still made to go through the motions, such as church on Sunday, religious classes, communion. And even as a young child, I never identified with what seemed to be silly traditions and customs. Even as a kid, the stories of the Bible were obvious fables, and I couldn't understand why we were meant to take such stories literally. Whenever I would ask questions seeking clarity, I was shot down time and again by the adults that always seemed to encourage me to just believe. Neighbors that hated one another, shaking hands in church and saying, "Peace be with you," and going right back to hating one another as soon as the sermon was over. Thanks to scholars whose work I discovered, I was able to look at my own religion with an academic and an objective point of view. Who was this man I was encouraged my whole life to worship 2,000 years after his alleged time on earth? Could I really expect that a loving God would cause me to burn for an eternity simply for asking questions? And when I discovered the atrocities, the bloodshed, the intolerance, the torture, the hypocrisy, the greed, and especially the rampant and continuing child abuse scandal, it was more than enough for me to purge the final remnants of this poisonous ideology from my mind, heart, and spirit once and for all. The use of torture was common. Inhumane practices for the use of extracting confessions were sanctioned and utilized as an official part of legal proceedings in most of Europe, and especially practiced by the Roman Catholic Church, which had approved its use during perhaps the Church's most violent period, the Spanish Inquisition, as punishment against heresy. That's what the word Inquisition means. It was a group or organization whose purpose was to root out heresy. Now, for heresy, see anyone that rejects the rigid dogmas of the church or thinks differently. That's what the word heresy literally means, a contradiction of a dogma. So basically anyone who even remotely opposed the church in those days. Pope Sixtus IV authorized the Spanish Inquisition, which would last 4 centuries. The first Grand Inquisitor was Thomas de Torquemada, whose tenure, according to official history and statistics, saw around 2,000 people burned to death. This is just in this psychopath's short tenure, so imagine the amount of people that were put to death. Elaborate public celebrations known as the auto de fe were carried out to root out heretics. Those convicted of heresy were awarded no trial, no legal counsel, no due process, and in effect, the inquisitors acted as judge, jury, and executioner. Many were jailed, tortured, or brutally murdered on suspicion alone. Those convicted of heresy had their property confiscated by the church, which added to its enormous wealth. People that reported others as heretics were often rewarded by the church. Church and government were not separate, therefore the church had the authority and ability to call upon the power of the crown to use against those convicted of heresy. The cross and the crown have been 2 symbols of tyranny and subjugation throughout history. There were many inquisitions as the church spread, including in Portugal, Mexico, Peru, and parts of Africa, among other locations. In his book Forgery in Christianity, Joseph Wheelis states, "When the Christians were weak and powerless, and subjected to occasional persecutions as enemies of the human race, they were vocal and insistent advocates of liberty of conscience and freedom to worship whatever God one chose. The Christian apologies to the emperors abound in eloquent pleas for religious tolerance, and this was granted to them and to all by the Edict of Milan and other imperial decrees. But When by the favor of Constantine they got into the saddle of the state, they at once grasped the sword and began to murder and despoil all who would not pretend to believe as the Catholic priest commanded them to believe. When today the Church screams persecution and bigotry at every criticism and every attempt to restrict it in some of its presumptuous usurpations, let it recall a few of the laws of intolerance, plunder, and death, which it procured and enforced from the moment it got the prostituted power, so long as that power lasted. And in her monumental work, The Christ Conspiracy, the Greatest Story Ever Sold, the scholar Atreya S. states, over a period of more than a millennium, the Church would bring to bear in this purification and conversion to the religion of the Prince of Peace the most horrendous torture methods ever devised, in the end slaughtering tens of millions worldwide. These conversion methods by Catholics against men, women, and children, Christians and pagans alike, included burning, hanging, and torture of all manner, using the tools described in 4th Maccabees. Women and girls had hot pokers and sharp objects slammed up their vaginas, often after priests had raped them. Men and boys had their penises and testicles crushed or ripped or cut off. Nothing more evil could possibly be imagined, and from this absolute evil came the rapid spread of Christianity. Well, those two quotes say an awful lot, and they're entirely true. Again, as I stated, I was basically driven to research the history of this institution and this ideology in which I was indoctrinated as a child. And when you discover these hideous methods that the Church used, it really it makes you really examine your beliefs and see it in a whole different way. Now, there were many varying methods and devices the Church utilized to enforce their expanding power. I think it's important to point out the mentality that has been and is still behind religions. The Catholic Church is a historically violent institution, and again, its criminal activities continue to the present day. The Church's conversion methods consisted of forcing conformity through absolute fear and abject terror. Particularly, during the times of the centuries-long Inquisitions, the Church became devilishly creative in its methods for extracting confessions. Among those methods and devices were the strappado. The time has arrived for humankind to transcend these limiting concepts, recognize them for what they are, and to evolve spiritually and consciously. They have done vastly more harm to the world than they have ever helped to resolve the world's problems. And it's about time that humanity transcends these limitations that we have allowed to be imposed upon us. In 2013, it came to light that the Vatican Bank was to be used in a smuggling operation that involved 20 million euros. Now, corruption and money laundering scandals have been connected to the Vatican for decades, but what else would you expect from a criminal enterprise? This, of course, was reported all over even the mainstream press, and in an article by Bloomberg Businessweek, we read, in its announcement Monday, the Vatican said that Ernst von Freiberg, a German lawyer who was named president of the bank earlier this year by former Pope Benedict XVI, would serve as interim general director. He replaces Paolo Caprini, who along with the bank's former president, Ettore Gatti Tedeschi, was placed under formal investigation in 2010 by Italian prosecutors for alleged money laundering. That investigation continues. Then, something that so few have ever heard of, something called the P2 scandal. P2 scandal, also known as Propaganda Masonica Due. Alexander Haig, who was a member of the secret society the Knights of Malta and Secretary of State under President Ronald Reagan, had heavy connections to Licio Gelli, a fellow knight and Freemason who was implicated in the massive scandal involving the Vatican, the Mafia, the CIA, and the Masons. Gelli obtained control over the P2 Freemasonic Lodge in Italy in 1966 and increased its membership from 14 to close to 1,000. The P2 Lodge was also known, as I said, as Propaganda Masonica Due, and was founded in 1877. The CIA was funding the P2 Lodge, which was brought to light by an Italian journalist named Mino Pecorelli, who was himself a P2 Mason. After Pecorelli went public, he was later found murdered, fatally shot in the mouth, which is what happens when you blow the whistle on the consortium. Gelli was, as well as a Freemason, a Bilderberger, Klaus Barbie. Author Jim Marrs claims that Gelli, about a lot of other, he had close ties with family, are willing servants, which isn't a bad name. But what was, to me, it's a little bit of in numerous scandals, including a nationwide bribery scandal, the hidden, although not so much these days, but the hidden murders of journalists who controls everything from Aldo Moro and banker Roberto Calvo. To clarify that. Now, the P2 Masonic Lodge included journalists, military leaders, industrialists, and politicians, just as the Bilderbergs, the CFR, just as the networks do today, had infiltrated Masonic lodges in the late 1700s. One of the consortium's techniques has always been infiltration by putting their place people into positions of power. And real quick right here, for those who might not have read any of my stuff or listened to any of these, when I say the word consortium, and let's not forget also, take a look at something called Operation Paperclip. Basically, after World War II, the Vatican arranged to have escaping Nazi war criminals, primarily scientists, relocated. And they used the Vatican as kind of a rat line for these escaping Nazi scientists and eugenicists. They were relocated to North and South America, different parts of the world, and the Vatican was instrumental in that. Look up something called Operation Paperclip. Now, in my studies of the history of this incredibly corrupted institution, what disgusted me and turned my stomach the most was the discovery of the ongoing and rampant child abuse scandal that has rocked the church in recent years. Most likely, I think it's because this is still occurring, and that I was so affected, it's because it's still happening that I was so affected by discovering this atrocity, and also because, to me, that is perhaps the most evil crime one can commit. But I've noticed over the years that some Catholics will get extremely angry with me for bringing up such topics as child abuse or the money laundering or other church crimes. They simply don't want to hear it and refuse to look at it. They will willingly turn a blind eye to the truth. And I suppose because it is too much of a shock to their thoroughly ingrained, deeply indoctrinated belief system. I mean, that's my guess, that it's just too much to bear because they've carried around this ideology, this belief system since they were very young. They have invested so much into it that the shock of looking at the truth of these matters is just too much. But as shocking as it is, I would suggest that people start to do that so that they could see what the foundations are. And let's not forget, too, that whenever the Catholic Church went into these areas and destroyed the inhabitants, they also destroyed their temples and stole the knowledge, the ancient manuscripts, documents, and codices, and either burned them or sequestered them. And then, in turn, they would build their temples upon the ancient ruins of indigenous peoples or different pagan cults or groups. In fact, the Vatican itself is constructed upon the ruins of the cult of Mithra. Mithra was a god who was said to have been put to death by crucifixion and rise in 3 days. And he was born of a virgin. I think I've heard this somewhere before. In fact, many of the attributes of Mithra are identical to that of Christ, and this occurs throughout history in many different cultures too. Human beings are encouraged to seek and give away their power to some perceived outside authority. The God of religions is the ultimate authoritarian Big Daddy archetype. Worship or be destroyed, believe or die, obey or be forgotten. What an amazingly powerful tool to be in the hands of oppressors, wouldn't you say? Now, the clergy and priestly classes have wielded this power for centuries and have entwined its twisted snares throughout the consciousness of humankind for far, far too long. Of course, this was done hand in hand with the monarchs, kings, rulers, and governments through the ages. Now, I've even heard one or two make the claim that it's just a few bad apples. Now, if by bad apples they mean despicable creatures, well, then I disagree, because it's way more than a few. Sit down and strap in for this one. To date, the Catholic Church has paid out some $2.7 billion in litigation and other costs, such as therapy for victims, legal fees, etc., that goes along with it. It's estimated that there were 100,000 victims in the United States alone, spanning back to at least the 70s. Child abuse has been a part of the Church basically since its inception. A few bad apples, it's rampant, and the actual scope and magnitude of these crimes is just completely fucked up. How many children have had their childhood and their lives destroyed? Now, Pope Benedict resigned in 2013 amidst allegations of complicity in the cover-up of abuse crimes when he presided as Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. When the last Pope Benedict was operating as Cardinal Ratzinger, from the highest levels, he ordered covers-up of certain dioceses, I believe in Texas, to actually just pretend that these crimes never occurred. And there's been numerous accounts of pedophile priests just being moved around from one place to another so that they could continue their criminal activity. The crimes of the Church continue to this day. This institution is based and built on hypocrisy and lies and torture and subjugation. I'm a recovering Catholic, and as a recovering Catholic, I could say that looking back on my life as a child, like I said, I never truly identify with it, so I was never completely ensnared by it. But I have witnessed others throughout my life that are, and to this day I see people that basically, you can tell they don't really believe, they just go through the motions, because it's what's expected of them. You know, what would my parents say if I defected from the church and said I no longer believe in that? Oh my God, horror of horrors. I personally don't give a shit what anyone thinks, including my family at the time. You know, they did try to pull me back in a little, but like I said, my parents were never that strict with it, so it was just kind of like, he's going to go do what he's going to do. I have seen other situations where it's not like that, where the parents or siblings or whoever would be completely offended by a person's decision to say, hey, I don't believe this anymore. It just breeds intolerance.